The Echo Chamber, brought to you by the Holmes Report and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers. Sponsored by the Bullet Group, putting you in tomorrow's conversations today.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. This is Arun Sudhaman with the Holmes Report. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Echo Chamber. This is Arun Sudhaman, and joining us on the podcast today, this is historic because it's actually the man who helped us launch the Echo Chamber back in, I think, 2012. Robert Phillips, of Jericho Chambers. Robert, how are you?
Yeah, thank you. It's good to be back. It's been an interesting few years since I was last on, but I've been following you as an avid listener, of course.
Yeah, no, it's been way too long since we had you on. Of course, you were on the first, I think, pretty much every episode from the first kind of 18 months.
Yeah, I wonder what I did to get dropped. That was the big question.
I'm not sure we dropped you. I felt like maybe you were you'd had enough of talking about the PR industry after you wrote a book called Trust Me, PR is Dead.
Yeah, and it would appear 5 years on that I was wrong. PR is clearly not dead. Whether it's the right kind of PR that seems to have come through the interregnum is another question.
Yes, indeed. And indeed, we reviewed your book, and I think what I said at the time was it was hard to disagree with your diagnosis of the kind of ills that were assailing the industry. But I think it also kind of came down a lot to how and what you described PR and what specifically you were referring to. Is that fair?
Yeah, you very kindly said at the time that it was a book about how PR should be, not what PR has become.
Yeah.
And I think reflecting on the past few years, and especially events of recent weeks where you see a very conscious rebranding of certain of the large agencies, I think there is still a big question mark about what PR has become, and whether people and the industry really has looked into its soul to address the more fundamental issues, rather than just continue to do what it's always been very good at, which is selling products and services.
Yeah. I mean, you still take the stance that the industry is still too, I guess you could say, cynically motivated in the pursuit of profit, perhaps. And
I'm not sure it's necessarily a cynicism, although I think there are certain people at the top of the industry who would certainly befit a cynical tag. I think PR, like so many other 20th century industries, has really struggled to come to terms with itself in the 21st century. And the questions that I was asking, not just 5 years ago when Trust Me, PR is Dead came out, but prior to that with my work on Citizen Renaissance and even the public engagement work that I did whilst CEO of Edelman. The real question is, how does communication, or where does communication fit into the new 21st century settlement between government, business and civil society? And I think that's the question, really, that the industry has failed to answer adequately. It's gone on very well. There's a line in my book attributed to the entrepreneur Luke Johnson. He said, where there's a buyer, there's a market.
Yeah.
And there's always a continuation of buyers and therefore continuation of sellers in the PR marketplace. But
except for Patisserie Valerie. Not sure there's any buyers for that. But anyway, yes.
Yes, that notwithstanding. But I suppose there's the joke in there somewhere about having your cake and eating it. But I think that it's really coming to terms with the more existential questions about why do we exist, what purpose do we serve. So looping back to your question around purpose and profit, I'm not sure that the PR industry has necessarily fully addressed the purpose question yet.
Well, it's not the only industry, I would imagine. And it's interesting because you mentioned that the settlement between government, business and the public, that compact.
Yeah.
Where do you rate government right now? Because if you look at the UK and the US, it's almost as if it's abdicated its responsibilities in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of my views have actually sort of radicalized or hardened since first publishing Trust Me, PR is Dead. And in that book, I did call for a new settlement. And obviously, we've seen, if you like, certainly, if not a collapse in government authority, certainly a reshaping of government authority and all this noise around fake news, which, by the way, I think pollutes the corporate sector as much as it pollutes the political sector. Um, there's a quote attributed to the Italian communist Antonio Gramsci in the 1930s, where he talks about the interregnum, the period in which the old is not yet dead and the new is not yet fully born. And he calls that period the interregnum. I think that's where we are between the late 20th century and the early 21st century. And Gramsci writes, in the interregnum, morbid symptoms persist. And if you begin to think about Donald Trump or Viktor Orban or Brexit as morbid symptoms, if you begin to think of some of the fakery that's gone on in both the political and corporate worlds as morbid symptoms, if you look at some of the corporate scandals that have persisted when we thought that we'd put them behind us, or the collapse of so-called trust, which I'm sure we can come on to discuss, these are just morbid symptoms. So I think we're in an interregnum, a sort of very strange and unstable, febrile period in both politics and business where there are no certainties. And that means there are no certainties around leadership, there are no certainties around trustworthy behaviors, there are no certainties around outcomes, and there's no certainties around stability. And one of the points that I made in my book originally was that the next generation, or the current generation of communications practitioners, needed to come to terms with this sort of messy chaos. And I think that in the PR industry's desire to always impose order, always impose control, always impose structure, I think that's antithetical to the messy chaos in which we find ourselves.
Is it possible to run a big agency network along those lines without the necessary order and by embracing chaos? I mean, some would say some networks do embrace chaos.
Yes, I was part of a network that accidentally embraced chaos or unintentionally embraced chaos. And I think this is one of the big questions or big discussions I had with Richard Edelman back in 2011, 2012, in which, I argued that the network of the future had to embrace chaos. And Richard's point was that may well be the case, but hey, simplicity sells. My counter argument to that is that we are not giving the best advice to our clients if we pretend that we can impose order on chaotic situations. And I think that there is an asymmetry in the world that we really have to come to terms with. And unfortunately, it's not in the doctrines, if you like, of either established public relations practice or established business practice or business school orthodoxy that really wants people to embrace asymmetry. People want nice, tidy solutions. They want answers by the end of the financial year. They want PowerPoint charts that only point in an upwards direction. But the world isn't like that. The world is much, much more messy, much more chaotic, much more unpredictable. And one of the reasons that with Jericho we built the models that we have is to be able to bring that chaos actually into the boardroom and to face it, head on, and to look dissent in the face rather than trying to control it or sort of, have it play to your tune. And I think that the wiser corporates and their counsellors are those who recognise that the world order has changed.
So it's kind of moving away from this notion that you can manage dissent.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I would say, actually, I would radicalize that and say not only can you not manage dissent, excuse me, not only can you not manage dissent, you have to welcome dissent into the decision-making process. And actually, this runs to the heart of my more recent work on trust or trustworthiness, which is that trustworthiness is built through demonstration of vulnerability. Of course, CEOs, political leaders historically have never wanted to demonstrate any vulnerability. They've always wanted to demonstrate macho control. And actually, by demonstrating dissent, or by welcoming dissent, you're demonstrating vulnerability. By demonstrating vulnerability, you're engendering more trustworthy behaviours, which then builds for more stable relationships in this new settlement between business, politics and civil society.
Do you find there's a receptive audience for that kind of thinking? Because, I know you're selling a service as well, right? But how do you make that case when you do have corporates for whom, that idea that they can control their outcomes, manage their message and shut out dissent is deeply ingrained?
Yeah, and I think, the English phrase is that it's very Marmite. People either love it or hate it. People either welcome it or reject it. There was a chapter in the book which was dedicated to the financial services sector and a bit to Ryanair called "It's Okay to be an arsehole," in which I argued that you can go on ignoring it if you want. You can go on behaving that profit and shareholder value has to be the only maxim in business, and that's not to say that you won't run a successful business. Whether that is an ethical and principled way to conduct your business is a moot point. And what I was arguing for was a rejection of that, if you like, Milton Friedman principle around the maximization of shareholder value and the celebration of profit over purpose, and trying to find a new and balanced way. And there are some business leaders who want to do that out of a genuine commitment to ethical, principled leadership, and others, some of my clients, do it as an act of faith as much as anything else. But it is a conscious choice. Just going back to your point about selling a service, we set Jericho up really as much as a if you like, as a social enterprise, or as a not-for-profit, as a commercial organisation. We're not driven by a profit motive. We don't have profit targets or revenue targets, and we don't have an exit strategy, and that does allow us to be much more flexible in the way that we work. The clients who are attracted to what we do are usually those who are either themselves at the vanguard of change and recognise that within their organisation the status quo is not sustainable. That may well be for enlightened or self-enlightened purposes, but they certainly recognise that in this sort of interregnum, something's got to give and something's got to change. So they're often themselves at the vanguard of change. Either that or their sector is itself under huge, usually regulatory pressure to reform, and what they're trying to do is effectively to get ahead of the curve, recognizing again that sort of trying to manage the message or behave in conventional terms won't cut it. And unfortunately, quite a lot of sectors are coming quite late to the party on this. And so they're sort of saying, yes, we need to do something, but that is after governments either nationally or supranationally have tried to impose new solutions.
It's interesting you mentioned your point about the vulnerable CEO. Is that a pattern that you're seeing more of? Are there people that you could point to as being emblematic of that trend, or is it still perhaps too few and far between at this stage?
I think at this stage it's few and far between, but the ambition is certainly greater, and this also speaks to the more recent conversations around gender and race and age diversity in the workplace. And in fact, I was having this conversation online with Sarah Hall, the former president of the CIPR. I think certainly as far as the public relations industry in itself is concerned, until we see a major generational and possibly gender shift in leadership, that change is not going to happen. So I think that may well be a proxy for industry and business more broadly. Yeah. There is still too much of a generation of pale, male and stale leaders hanging on. And I think it's only when diversity in all its dimensions, not just in terms of race or gender, takes hold that we'll begin to see a shift. One of the encouraging things, I think, for whatever we now call the PR industry, whether it's the progressive PR industry or the communications marketing PR industry, is that the younger generations seem less tolerant of this sort of age of control, seem less tolerant of this sort of macho culture. And so hopefully there is a shift underway.
Indeed. What are your thoughts on, let's say, Unilever CEO Paul Polman? Because he's always been held up as the kind of poster child of the purpose-driven CEO for a number of years now. I mean, has your thinking on him shifted at all?
No, I think in a way, Polman is a great example of someone at the vanguard. Indra Nooy at Pepsi, again, although, as soon as the Pepsi share price came under pressure, of course, so did her performance with purpose mantra come under pressure too. Ditto when Polman, didn't see the bid from Kraft coming. It was seen as a time he had to escape his purpose-driven mantra. Unilever is not perfect, as most large global corporations are not perfect. But what Pullman and a few others have done is signify that there is another way of behaving and that there is a way of embedding proper purpose within an organization. And I think that some of the people who are quick to criticize Pullman because they see him as too messianic, if you like, I think are judging him unfairly. I think there is a genuine commitment to change, and change is not easy. Yeah. And, change is full of contradictions. That's the other thing that within Jericho, we try and, help our clients understand. And it's not easy because they are tutored on having definite results, but within a definite period for a definite amount of money and a definite return on investment. And in the current settlement or lack of settlement, that just may not be possible. And our work on responsible tax is a case in point. We are beginning to inform the global tax debate on a number of levels, on a number of very specific areas, from developing world to digital taxes and rethinking corporation tax. But there is no easy answer. There's no immediate answer. So it goes back to this whole point about messy chaos and infinite shades of grey. And of course, that's not where business leaders like to be. They still like to be in a world of black and white, not in a world of grey. And PR as an industry was designed historically to reinforce either the black or the white.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about the Responsible Tax Project. This is something that you're doing in conjunction with KPMG, correct?
Correct, yeah.
And what was the thinking behind it? Why did it kind of come into being?
Well, originally, actually, it was at the start when I was beginning to do the research around Trust Me, PR is Dead, and about the whole point about it was pointless trying to manage the message and pointless trying to use communications as a way of working a way out of a crisis, and that really better policy was needed, and that policy had to be rooted in purpose. And Jay McCormack, who was then the UK head of tax, now is the global head of tax, who I have to say is probably the bravest and most visionary business leader I've ever worked with, heard me sort of talk about these ideas, and they were just ideas at that stage, and said, I think this is the answer to the current tax dilemma, which has become incredibly entrenched in terms of, yah-boo politics, if you like, around taxation, with people really looking to either say, tax in one direction or no tax in another direction, but they were incredibly polarized and quite ill-informed views. And what Jane and I started to do was, first of all, ask not how can we communicate better around issues of tax, but how can we address the substantive issues around tax, including what is the purpose of tax itself? Right. And whilst that may sound like quite a trite question, we began, we ended up working this through with a number of KPMG partners and then using the dissenting model that we were talking about earlier, bringing people into the conversation who really were very hostile to KPMG and their thinking. That included Margaret Hodge, who was then chairman of the Public Accounts Committee, a very vocal critic of KPMG, Richard Murphy, the tax campaigner, who again was a very vocal critic of the Big Four, and saying to them, look, we are digging at what the real purpose of tax is, and we have this sense that tax is the entry fee we pay for a civilized society, and without tax we don't get roads, schools, hospitals, and so on. And so how do we rethink responsible tax based on the purpose of tax, not based on the politics of tax? And by bringing those people into the conversation, and that stakeholder group started with 16 people and is now a community globally of over 2,000, again, right across the spectrum, left to right, corporate to public sector, NGO and activists through to academics and experts, they have begun to put together a very new or a completely different dialogue based on the purpose of tax and responsible tax principles and responsible tax policies that flow from that on any number of areas. And in fact, we've just published our second publication in the series, which is imaginatively entitled What to Tax, which followed on a publication around the developing world and tax policy. And again, that brings all these voices across the spectrum in to have an informed conversation and informed debate. And if you like, a lot of these groups are peer reviewing their own policies and ideas so that things are not being just drummed up, no pun intended, given the nature of this podcast, in echo chambers, but are being thought on a much more multilateral basis.
It's interesting because tax is really one of the biggest drivers in terms of corporate behavior, in terms of corporate reputation. And as you've mentioned, it is a really important policy issue. But the cynical view, I guess, is that corporations are always looking to reduce the amount of tax they pay, and they go to enormous lengths to minimize their tax liabilities, to avoid tax. They base themselves in different countries. They look for loopholes. Is that the kind of thing that you're looking to address with this project?
Well, there is, and again, if anyone wants to go to the Responsible Tax website, you can see, we, in the interest of transparency, we film a lot of our roundtables and events and publish transcripts of them. So you can see the conversation specifically on avoid, and apologies, by the way, if you're getting a bleeping in the background. I'm not quite sure how to turn that one off.
I think we're okay. I don't hear it.
Okay, good. Okay, it's only hearing at my end. In the interest of transparency, you can see a number of those conversations on film and in transcript on the web, including one which we held in Amsterdam about a year ago on avoidance and evasion. But in answer to your question, yes, one of the reasons that tax fascinates me is that tax does sit at the heart of the new social compact, without any measure of doubt. Yeah. Because, as I said before, without tax, and tax is the entry fee we pay for a civilized society. And even if you look at the current debate around corporation tax, which I think is highly politicized and mostly misinformed, and people are now looking at digital services taxes, but what they're failing to understand is we live in a digital economy. So you can't really differentiate between corporation tax and digital taxes. Why is a supermarket delivery service any more or less digital than Amazon or Apple, which happens to be either a warehouse company or a watch distribution company, as well as a digital company? So I think that in a way, tax is a proxy for the sort of society we want to live in, and that's one of the reasons it's so fascinating. To the second part of your question is, don't corporates always want to minimize their tax bill and avoid tax? I think the answer is no. That's not the case. It may well be the popular perception, but I've worked with a number of tax directors, a large number of tax directors across Fortune 500 and FTSE 100 companies. And I've worked with them in coalition with activists, with NGOs, with campaigners, with academics, with media commentators. And actually what they rail against is double taxation, unnecessary double taxation, or ill-informed tax policy. I think everyone understands, or not everyone, but certainly the majority of people understand that what we're looking at is a fair and responsible settlement. So I think it's a misnomer. Of course, there'll always be outliers, but it's a misnomer to say that the corporate world is just there to minimize its tax bill. And in certain instances, and there are great examples, Unilever you mentioned earlier, GSK is another, where a lot of the large global organizations or corporates understand their responsibilities, especially in relation to the developing world, in terms of increasing both tax capacity and tax take in those countries, and the way that actually it would generate better economies and better societies as a result.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned some of the issues around fake news earlier. And I'm curious how you see that unfolding from your vantage point, specifically in terms of how the big social media platforms have addressed this problem. Do you think that they've done enough?
No. And I don't think they've done enough. And I think there's an awful lot of many forked tongues speaking in this debate coming out of Silicon Valley, because I think it's a curious mix of pseudo-hippieism and rampant US libertarianism that they've yet to resolve. I worry that in certain instances, they are trying to close the proverbial stable door after the horse has bolted, specifically around some of the racist and misogynistic language that you see online. And I think that what we're now dealing with in some instances is the unforeseen consequences of the social digital age that we didn't stop and ask questions hard enough about 10 or 15 years ago, when we realized what the network society could potentially unleash. I think we all look to the optimism of Tim Berners-Lee and not necessarily the nihilism of I don't know, name any number of racist or misogynistic or populist organizations that are not acting in the interest of the common good. That said, I think the issue of fake news is interesting. I would urge people to read Yuval Noah Harari's latest book, 21 Lessons of the 21st Century, in which he talks about the fact that fiction making or myth building has always been part of the human sort of condition, and that fake news is nothing new. And he quotes both the Bible and the Quran as epic works of fiction, on which actually not just whole societies were built, but in some way good societies were built as well. Yep. So we tend to look at the fake news through the ugly prism of Donald Trump or others, but in fact, certain fictions can be good fictions. football teams and our pursuit of them or our fandom around them is another good example of that.
Yeah, those are
I
not
think
good fictions if you're an Everton fan.
not
let me
necessarily
tell
good
you.
fiction. Yeah, I think so I think in that sense, a lot of the fake news stuff is slightly overblown in the same way that there's a lot of bullshit talked around trust, which those who've been following my work over the past 4 or 5 years will know that I've tried to sort of shine a disinfecting light on in a number of ways, which is that we like to think that there was some halcyon age of trust, which there never was. The evidence doesn't support that. None of the data supports that. And we like to think there was a halcyon age of truth. In fact, what there was a halcyon age of control. This goes back to what we were saying earlier about the way that communications in particular, especially in a more analog-driven society, was able to exercise a degree of control and authority over an unruly rabble that's out there in the mass. And that gave a sort of perception, if you like, a false perception of trust or a false perception of truth. What really worries me about fake news is not necessarily how it's sort of deployed and then amplified by political leaders, but also how the corporate world is sort of cottoning onto this as well. And I've heard a few anecdotal instances of business leaders asking to do a Trump because they recognise that by sort of putting out an untruth, they can sort of effectively pursue a revisionist version of events. Yeah. And I think that is a worrying trend. And I think that a number of PR firms maybe are rushing to see the dollar signs in pursuing this agenda rather than stopping and asking themselves the questions around, is this ethical, is this principled, is this right?
Yeah, that is worrying. It's interesting that you frame fake news in the context of humanity, I guess. You know, referring to Yuval Noah Harari's book, and indeed, I think in his book *Sapiens*, he mentions that this whole idea of collective fiction is what separates sapiens from animals, right? Yeah. What is Trump a symptom of?
Well, I think Trump is. I think going back to my point about the interregnum, the old is not yet dead, the new is not yet fully born. That's the interregnum, and in the interregnum, morbid symptoms persist. Donald Trump is a very morbid symptom of a world that's neither hasn't come to terms with either the death of the old or the birth of the new, and that's why I don't think others follow Trump. I think Trump is a symptom, not a cause, of the current malaise, a failure to come to terms with a very changing world. I wrote at the time, actually I wrote prior to Trust Me, PR is Dead, going back to 2011, and then prior to that to the global financial crisis, that our failure to listen to the message of Occupy, we are the 99%, would come back to haunt corporate world. And that will give rise to both shareholder activism, employee activism, NGO activism, which would bring intolerable pressures on organizations licensed to operate. And I stand by that mantra. And in some ways, Trump is, and others, Brexit's another good example, or the Five Star Movement, or the Swedish Democrats, are a failure for society to ask themselves the more profound and meaningful questions 10, 20 or 30 years ago, and trying to think they could continue to communicate or spin their way out of that crisis through superficial means. So I think it's a more profound issue and challenge.
So a couple of quick hits before I leave you. Thoughts on the Iceland campaign, which has been banned. Cynical stunt or worthy cause?
Both. The two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. No, it's the oldest trick in the book, isn't it, to get your ad campaign banned? But that doesn't mean the message that campaign, is trying to get across is not necessarily a worthy one. I'm not party to what decisions were made at Iceland, whether it was a deliberate attempt to get the ad banned or not. But that doesn't take away the power of the message.
I assume they knew, because the ad was banned because it's a Greenpeace video rather than the actual content. So I would assume they would have known that.
Possibly. By the way, I mean, there is a point in here which I think goes back partly to some of the stuff we talk about responsible tax. A lot of the NGOs, and we saw this with the Oxfam and Save the Children scandals earlier in the year and last year, have adopted the moniker or the mantra of corporate behaviours. So I think it's naive to look at, all corporates in the bad corner and all NGOs in the good corner, because some of those NGOs display bad corporate behaviour, and some of the corporates, as Unilever we talked about earlier, displays good NGO behaviour. I mean, Paul Polman is on record, isn't he, as saying that he wanted Unilever to become the world's largest NGO. Yeah. So again, I think this speaks to the sort of the bumpy settlement that we're trying to find our way around at the moment.
Yeah, it's a very good point. Thoughts on the walkout of Google employees over sexual harassment?
Well, I mean, that goes back to my point about employee activism, yep. and again, it's a seminal article. Well, I think it was seminal that I wrote in 2010, which led to the work that I ended up doing in Cass Business School around employee activism. To me, the activist employee was an axiom, and we were willfully blind to it 10, 15 years ago. It was partly because of the communication tools now at our disposal, which means that we don't have to go through layers of authority to communicate with one another. It's partly through the freedom that social media brings. It's partly through the liberation and awareness of the next generation of people. So am I surprised? No. Am I surprised that Google is, as it goes back to my point about it may be on the do, or like to think of itself on the do no evil spectrum, but that doesn't mean that parts of it won't demonstrate poor corporate behaviour as any other large organisation will at some point. So I'm not surprised either at the walkout or the inevitability of it or the bad behaviour of Google. It's just another corporate at the end of the day.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting though, because it's something we haven't really seen, not to that kind of extent and at such a big company.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the interesting things, and you and I talked about this, you may recall, several years ago, at the time of when the News of the World folded, at what point will consumer or employee activism really bring a company down? Yeah. It hasn't happened yet. We've come close. And I'm not saying that the employee walkouts at Google would ever bring the company down. But there are a number of instances whereby the boycotting of a product, or we saw it actually in bits in the early stages of tax around Starbucks, Google, and Amazon. But of course, people find Google and Amazon just too convenient. And whilst they had a choice in Starbucks to go to Costa or Cafe Nero, at the end of the day, it didn't count for much. But I think at some point, we will see a brand or a corporation brought down by activism, whether it's the activism of employees, the activism of shareholders, the activism of NGOs, or a combination of all of those things. I guess that is inevitable, as long as people can sort of shift their mindset from the sheer convenience of buying that particular product or service.
Yeah, it would be no bad thing though, right? Because unless bad behavior has a cost, then it will persist.
Yeah, and that I think takes us back to our conversation around, progressive PR or whatever that's meant to be, which I don't think is progressive in the slightest. That seems to me to be a relabeling, an attempt to position one agency or one consultancy versus another agency. I don't think it's progressive in the slightest in terms of what the new social settlement would be. Progressive PR would be understanding that the license to operate of any organisation is under threat from employee activism, shareholder activism, or NGO activism to such an extent that it has to fundamentally change its behaviours, not just the way it communicates or the way that accesses its communications data. That's a more progressive settlement, and I think the industry is a long way away from reaching into that yet.
Yeah. Well, Robert, thank you very much. If PR is dead, it's good to see that your brain is very much alive. And we should get you back on the podcast soon, I hope.
It's nice to be back. I've taken a break to think about stuff a lot, and I've watched events unfold from the sidelines to an extent that obviously I work on tax, or I work on housing, or I work on the future of work. We've got 8 of the sort of tax-like coalitions now running, which are building this new settlement. So it's clear that there are different ways to tackle communications. but I think I was probably wrong in calling the early death of the PR industry, because I think commercially it's still in pretty good health.
Reasonably good health, although I think there are issues at the bigger end of the spectrum that we had discussed before on this podcast. And that will come as, no surprise to regular readers of the Holmes Report anyway.
No, and I think something Martin Sorrell is looking at, interestingly.
Yes, indeed. Well, thank you very much. Good luck with the tax project, of course, and we'll talk to you again soon, I hope.
Brilliant. It's great connecting, and thanks for having me on.
And I'm joined today in Hong Kong by the President and CEO of the Institute of PR, Tina McCorkindale. Tina, welcome.
Thanks, Arun, for having me. This is great.
Welcome to Hong Kong.
Thanks.
It's great to have you here. You are speaking at an event later today, I think. An IPR event with Paige?
Yes, so we're
right?
doing an event with Paige at AIA with Steve Thomas as one of our trustees. So.
Okay, cool. And what's the kind of idea behind that? What's the objective?
Well, every year we try to do some sort of presentation or symposium in Hong Kong and to try to, I guess, get some of the research out there of what we're talking about and keeping people up to date. So this is our annual trip to Hong Kong.
Wow. Well, you've picked a perfect time of year for it, I think.
Oh, it's great. It's not
amazing.
Hot.
It's not hot.
It's nice and kind of mild.
It's not cold.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the IPR, because how long have you been in your role now?
3.5 years.
Okay, right. And for people who don't know exactly what the IPR does, perhaps you could explain for our listeners' benefit.
Sure. So we're a nonprofit research foundation, and we do research that matters to the profession. And we've been around for, it'll be 62 years that we've been around. And so we have different focus of research that we do. Measurement, digital media, internal comms, all sorts of different areas. And all our research is available for free. And we have a weekly research letter that people can sign up for. And we have, and we're trying to be more global as well. So we have people from all over the world who write for our research letter, so we could stay up to date with the latest research in the profession.
Yeah, and I was actually having a look on the website, and there is a lot of really interesting resources, so I would recommend our listeners to check it out. And as you mentioned, some really important areas that you do research into, one of which, of course, is measurement. I was reading about that. I don't know if that's something you want to discuss right now. I was reading a post about how there's this kind of stasis in measurement, and it's still not really progressing. Is that how you see it as well?
Yes. So Jim McNamara wrote a great post for us, and he's based in Australia. And I think sometimes with measurement, we're having the same conversations that I think we were having in the mid 80s, probably.
Wow.
And we still can't answer the question of, well, I guess it's also what is the goal of measurement? You have people who still, the goal of measurement is to prove value rather than be predictive and help make smarter decisions.
Okay.
But sort of, and then like what to measure? Is it reputation? Is it employee satisfaction? Is it engagement? Or is it media impressions, which is a poor metric anyway? But so there's all sorts of different metrics, and trying to figure out which one is difficult.
It's interesting in that post, I think the phrase that Jim used was it functional stupidity or something like that?
It's a great phrase.
Is a really great phrase. And not just the phrase, but his explanation for it, which is basically that firms are necessarily not invested in getting good measurement because they've been overpromising all along anyway.
Yes.
So they're not necessarily that interested in very rigorous measurement of what they're doing.
No, we call that success theater, that people go around touting their success, that we got 8 billion views. And you're like, wait, how many people are in the world, right? Like, that is impossible. Right. So then because of this, we've created this sort of culture of, we're still so focused on impressions, and it's the wrong thing to be focused on.
Yeah, okay. So you spoke at our Provoke conference in Washington, D.C.
Very provoking.
It was very provocative.
It was.
I think, and it was
a great conference.
Thank you very much. It was, and thank you for being part of it. Thank you for doing the last session on the last day. I think that's always tough, but you guys brought a lot of energy to it. and it was quite highly rated as well.
Great.
So well done. So it was 2 weeks ago. I mean,
it seems like it was like 10 years ago.
I know, it really does. And what the topic you were talking about was companies joining this kind of purpose bandwagon. And we just hear so much talk now about how companies have to elucidate their beliefs, they have to take a stance sometimes on political issues, they have to stand for something more than just selling products. What's your view on that?
Oh gosh, how long is this podcast?
It can be as long as you want, really. Yeah, we've got plenty of time.
Yeah, I think sometimes our industry sort of just whatever comes up, we're like, we should get on this, and we're always sort of jumping on. The title was talking about the purpose bandwagon and jumping on the bandwagon, and I think, and when you're dealing with purpose and really looking at a purpose, every company is really different, and it's very closely tied to mission. And people just throw, and what I talked about in the panel is that people are throwing this term around of purpose. Some people equate it with social responsibility. Some people see it as the mission of the organization. But so I think stepping back and saying, what are we doing? Do we have the capability to do it as an organization? And does it make a difference? Because what we've seen is that you have some executives who say to the CCO or whomever, we got to get on this purpose thing because so-and-so is on purpose and we need it. And that's a terrible approach to take. It has to be very strategic and very thoughtful and also some companies, and there's like this purpose continuum. Some companies are better suited for this sort of overall purpose-driven organization versus others who may just dabble in it but still have a purpose. So there's just variations, and we're just talking about it as if it's this one overarching thing when there's so many different facets to it.
Yeah, it does seem like there's something of a bandwagon, though, right? In that it's a fad, and maybe if we're being a little cynical, public relations firms are seeing it as a way to make more money, frankly, because they can sell these services around purpose. Do you worry that there'll be any kind of a backlash?
I think there will be. I think so. What I see overall, if we even take a step back from that, is that we're very focused on. We're doing so many stakeholder segmentations by generation, like the Gen Zers and millennials, and there are so many different variations of millennials and who they are. You can be a millennial who's in college, or a millennial who's a VP at a company with 2 kids and a family, who's higher socioeconomic status. So there's all these different millennial variations, but this is what the research shows, is that people are expecting companies to have some sort of overall purpose and contribution to purpose. And we also see with like the UN Sustainable Goals that we're also focused more on overall purpose and contributions to society. So I think it's as long as stakeholders demand it, it will continue to be important. But I think it's a good reflection point too for companies to step back and say, who are we, where do we need to be, and are we contributing to the betterment of society as a whole? Yeah,
okay, that's a good way of looking at it. So let's talk a little bit about some of the other research you're doing. You mentioned you have, I think, a fairly big study coming up on gender in leadership. And is that looking specifically at the PR agency industry?
So what we did 10 focus groups, and we looked at mid-level women and men separately, and then executive level women and men separately. So for instance, we had a few focus groups with like CCOs, agency heads, just females, led by a female moderator. And then counterpart to that is we had male focus groups with CCOs and agency heads run by a male moderator. Because we wanted to find out about various questions related to mentorship and how people feel about their progression in positions, and to hear stories about people and how they feel they progressed. Like, do they feel there's a glass ceiling where they are? How is their professional development opportunities, and how can the industry be better at helping support leadership? Because the research, this is a very heavy female profession, right? Yeah. But the leadership position is closer to 75% male and 25% female.
Yeah, it's kind of it's like a mirror image, isn't it?
Yes, and then if you get into race and ethnicity, that number's even significantly lower. So
tell us about some of the findings. What were the kind of headline findings that you can share?
Sure, we're going to release it in a couple weeks, and it's fascinating just listening to people tell these stories. One thing we found, and that most people said, is that formal mentorship programs in organizations typically don't work.
Okay.
And a lot of organizations, agencies are investing money into these mentorship programs. And people said it's very hard to click with somebody when you have this. Instead, informal mentors, supporters, even peer-to-peer relationships seem to be more important. And this whole concept of mentorship for both women and men seemed to be sort of a newer thing, where some of the both women and men who've been in the industry for a long time said, we really didn't have mentor programs going up, and we just sort of glommed onto somebody to help us. And then we looked at different skills and abilities, and people for the most part said it has nothing to do with leadership, has nothing to do with sex. It has to do with your capabilities and skills. And then we asked questions about basically that got down to sexism in the profession. And some of the male focus groups said, well, there's sexism in the C-suite. So until you fix the C-suite at a macro level, it's not going to change. And but the stories that the women told were, to me, the most fascinating, of just feeling excluded in some cases, or others who've been very successful and try to sort of pay it forward. So there's definitely a lot of different variation with this topic, but it's a really important topic. And and what we also want to do, we're going to do a survey, like a survey of the profession following this, but what we want to do is have some very solid action items of what we can do to move this forward, instead of just doing a research study, that we can be actionable and say, here's what we need to do.
How did the male groups, focus groups, respond to the observation that females were being excluded?
It was what was interesting is that the male focus groups didn't think that there was different. They were like, no, I haven't seen it. It's really not there. I mean, we see it some, but it's just really not there. And I haven't really seen women not move up in their field because of it. And the women had a very different story to tell, that it was just like story after story. And it was stories of feeling excluded, whether it's like clients or something like that, or even we asked questions about policies, and there's differences with policies, with even women and men. Like some don't even have paternity policies. So if we really want equality in the profession, we have to think about also the men as well, because if you're giving a female 3 months off paid and you're giving a male 2 weeks off, it also the male is able to also accelerate their,
of course, yeah, it's an imbalance,
more than than imbalance, and then they're taking time off, and then so it's interesting too, just the policies.
Okay, so that's out in 2 weeks.
Yes,
all right.
or beginning of December. So we're really excited about that.
Yeah,
that'll be good, and the
definitely.
survey will be even better.
Definitely, we'll look forward to that one. So let's talk a little bit about the name PR.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, this is a very controversial issue these days.
Yes.
Who knew, huh? Who knew with everything that's going
that
on
we have to,
that this would be the most controversial issue? I mean, it's we've got elections, there's all sorts of political issues, but the big thing is, what should we call public relations? So, of course, Golin, an agency that I think you know well,
yes,
I know well, has come out and with a new positioning that is kind of overtly embracing the phrase PR, public relations. I don't think there's anything really unreasonable about that, I suppose, but it seems to have triggered a certain amount of consternation in the industry, which is interesting, and it seems to be consternation for a couple of reasons. One, I think, is some people just in general see these kinds of agency repositioning exercises as self-indulgent, which I guess everyone's entitled to their opinion. The second thing is you do have, I've seen people kind of actively repelling this idea that it should be called public relations. And if you look at agencies in general, and indeed in particular if you look at the corporate departments, there's many that don't use the terminology PR now. They use strategic communications, or they use integrated communications, or they use, earned advocacy or engagement. So Tina, where do you stand on this, the big question of our time?
So what's interesting is that I see PR as sort of getting the same treatment as, in a way, fake news. Like, we've taken this term and then President Trump has taken this term and just made it very incorrect as to actually what it is or what it's trying to define. But PR has been around, the term PR has been around a really long time. And then I guess with, you have the media or people talk about PR in a negative way. It sort of stains the industry, or they talk about spin and it stains the industry. But a name is a name is a name. So if we want to but PR regardless, it doesn't matter what it's called, it really is about building relationships. And I mean, if you just take it out of everything else, like, public relations is really what we do.
Right.
We're building relationships with all sorts of stakeholders. So I do stand by that, because people, and even PRSA had this, where they tried to get added to a bylaw, add public relations and communications, and people flipped. Like,
really?
They were like, absolutely not. This is the PRSA. This isn't the Communication Society of America.
Wow.
And so I think that there seems to be just inconsistency in the profession. And I know that USC and you work on a study with Fred Cook, and they asked this question, and people think it should be called corporate communications. But that's one-sided, because we can't just be corporate-centric. There's so many different organizations. I'm a nonprofit, right? Yeah. Nonprofits they're not corporate communication. They do public relations. But I don't know. Yeah, it's kind of a stain, but it's also historical.
You're right. I mean, we do that study, the Global Comms Report, which interestingly is called Communications Report. And I remember we had a discussion about what to call it. And the thinking was that if we called it communications, it would have more appeal to people on the client side than if we called it, for example, the Global PR Report. We, as an organization, really Paul Holmes is very keen on the phrase public relations, because in his view, he thinks that there's nothing that describes what this industry does better than public relations, right? And if you look at the definition of public relations, I think that's probably correct. I just wonder if the risk is that as you've mentioned, the kind of phrase PR has become, whether it's stained or diluted or somewhat disenfranchised, and it now stands for almost a multitude of sins. And especially on the client side, I see, you very rarely see a PR department or a head of PR or a PR director.
That's right. Communication or global comms or
it's always communications. Something. And that I think is a worry, because if you think about it, communications is a tactic, right?
It is a tactic, and it's a very broad term, but we as an industry have done an awful job at protecting that term PR.
Right.
It's been even I see, you see surveys that there was a survey that asked, like, which PR person do you most connect with? And it was like Samantha from Sex and the City and from Scandal. And you're like, this is not doing our profession any favors. AbFab, it totally was. Like Adina from AbFab.
That would be mine if I had to choose.
If I had to choose, that's the same. But it's just sort of missing, so we just don't do a good enough job, and we do it to ourselves too. So
yeah, but do you think it's an important debate to have, just in general, to expend energy on figuring out what to call ourselves, or do you think it's kind of irrelevant?
I think it would help if everybody was on the same page. I mean, because people call marketing...
I see what you did there.
Did you like that?
I did, yeah. Very nice.
Because you have marketing, and people they don't have like variations, right? Yeah. Marketing, unless they combine it with and make it like an integrated department or something along those lines. But people are very clear it's marketing or finance or HR, but PR, it just differs from place to place.
Yeah.
And it just doesn't do us any favors. If we all stuck to it, and if we all said this is what it is, then I think we'd be more successful.
I think so. And I actually think, I kind of like that Golan has kind of overtly made this decision. I mean, I think it will attract criticism for sure, but then you kind of think if you're not attracting criticism, then you're not really being very bold in your decision making. Should we talk about PR being used as a verb and as a noun? Is that
if you want to?
Yeah, that really.
We're public relationsing.
I mean, you see it in the UK a lot. Let's PR this. Let's talk to APR. I mean, that really
it's annoying.
Drives me nuts.
It's annoying.
Anyway, well, that's a discussion that will run and run, I imagine. So you're going to talk today, I think, later on today. I mean, it'll be by the time this podcast comes out, you will have already spoken at the forum.
It'll be amazing.
I'm sure.
It was an amazing presentation.
It was an amazing.
Wasn't it great?
I've already seen this presentation, right? It's the same one you gave in
India.
In India, in Hyderabad.
Yes. You're the only duplicate person who's going to be there today. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll pretend it's new. Not that you recycle your presentations. I'm sure
I do sometimes.
You do. Okay. Yeah. Right. At least you're honest about it.
You have to.
You absolutely have to. If you're on the caravan, you have to.
Yeah.
So, and that's about the science of storytelling, and that's looking at how kind of behavioural science is changing. Do you actually see these techniques? And we've been talking about them a lot. We kind of have sessions at all of our conferences for years now. I mean, really going back 6 or 7 years. But do you see these techniques actually being adopted by companies and by agencies? Or is it still theory rather than practice?
Yeah, I think you definitely see it more in marketing because they have behavioral marketing sort of functions under marketing that they hire behavioral scientists to, and that they're on hand that can help understand audiences and help predict what audiences will do or how to change behavior. For PR, we're not fully there yet. I think people do adopt some of these techniques and strategies, but it's not that we have like a formal, we have data scientists who can go in and pull data or do whatever, but we don't necessarily have behavioral scientists. And the reason why I know that is because we're putting together a guide for hiring behavioral scientists. So we wanted to talk to companies and agencies to find out, tell me about your behavioral scientists.
And they don't have any.
There's a couple that do.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So like
Companies
Southwest is an example. Ogilvy has a huge behavioral science function.
They do. Chris Graves
with Chris Graves.
Way
that's
ahead
right.
on this. Yeah.
He's way ahead on this, and he has.
He's almost too far ahead, though.
He's so far ahead.
He really is. Yeah.
And it's because he has gone in it's almost that he did his own PhD, like he's an autodidactic PhD in behavioral science because he's combed through, and I'm not exaggerating, like hundreds of articles.
I know he sent me
hundreds of articles.
There was a period where he was sending me a lot of research papers on neuroscience. Did
you fall off his list? Did he stop sending those to you?
Well, are you still getting them? Have I been removed?
I don't.
Have I been removed?
I must have been removed too.
Yeah, I'm not sure he's sending them anymore.
I think because he's so on the circuit with it that he probably just doesn't have time because he's really out there. I mean,
we jest, but really, I think he deserves a lot of credit for flagging it. I do wish the industry would take it more seriously, but it's people I've spoken to in the industry will say, yes, it's great and wonderful, but we have enough trouble getting clients to pay for planning and evaluation, and now adding another thing in, it's just hard with the model.
But then they're not doing it right if that's the case. Because you can easily you can make serious changes with just implementing a technique. So instead of, and they call this, there's like a term for it where it's called libertarian paternalism. And what that means is that I'm help guiding you, but you still have the freedom to make a choice. So whether it's automatically having you opt into a retirement program, but there's a lot of also debate that we haven't really talked about in the profession, the ethics surrounding it. Like that's for good. Like we're trying to help you make how we can help you stop smoking or how we can help you do X. But on the
it could be
flip side of that, you can get people to do things that are not necessarily
could be used for
ethical.
Nefarious. It's
Definitely.
that kind of nudge.
It's the nudge, yes,
theory.
exactly right. It's like the Richard Thaler nudges, where how do you get people to change their recycling habits, or how do you get people to, which is clearly good for society. But there's a lot of things that probably aren't good for society that you can nudge. So.
Okay. All right. Well, I look forward to that this afternoon. Tina, thank you so much.
Thanks. This was great. Yes.
Yeah. And I look forward to seeing you again, I'm sure, at another event.
Of course.
Sometime soon.
That would be great.
Thank you all for listening, and a big shout, as always, to our production partner, Marketeers, and our sponsor, Bullet. Thank you all.
You've been listening to The Echo Chamber. Brought to you by The Holmes Report and produced by Marketeers. Sponsored by the Bullet Group, putting you in tomorrow's conversations today.